Work Week was an interesting read. I read it when I first started out as an entrepreneur. It was one of those first books. I read a couple of first. One was the 4 Hour Work Week. The other one was Chris Gillibut. I always, mess up his name, but it was the $100 Startup. And the third one was Michael Port's books. Book Yourself Solid, right? Those are my three beginner books. I mean, there have been other books since then that have definitely heavily influenced me, but those are the three that started out my, hey, maybe this can be a thing, even when I was in corporate, thinking about, hey, you could start. $100 Startup was about you could start your business at a very, very low cost and different ways to start that didn't necessarily need a lot. Now, I don't know if you can still do just 100, but didn't need a lot, right? And so that was my first entry into even thinking that way. And then Book Yourself Solid was my first entry into thinking about different ways of getting clients, and really the red velvet rope strategy, which is what they talk about in that book, where you're really targeting people based on their needs, based on what their wants, and you're not thinking, I can do this for everyone. And I read that first, and even went to a couple of his programs, but I read that first when I was still doing web design. And that was really impactful for me at the time because, websites, anyone, right? So I was one of those people that was going out there like, hey, you need a website, you need a website, you need a website. And so when I read Book Yourself Solid, that really helped to hone me in on, you need an audience, you need who you do these websites for. It doesn't have to be, it shouldn't be for everyone, and that you really needed to focus on these are the people that you want to serve. So that book was really helpful back then with that, and really honestly changing the way I view things, which led me into Faceless, we'll talk about in a minute. And then the third book, which is what the question was around, was the 4 Hour Work Week. And I read all his book. I read the 4 Hour Work Week. I read the 4 Hour Body. There's another 4 hour something. So I read all the 4 hours, right? And used to follow him very closely. But reading the 4 Hour Work Week was really monumental in thinking about how I can condense the work. And I read it back then when I was working in corporate, and it really started making me think about, how to outsource work. You don't have to do everything, and all of those good things that, I think a lot of us missed, or a lot of us maybe have never heard or read. I personally even had missed it and not even heard or read it as much as I did recently. And so last year, as I was exploring Faceless and thinking about that, I went back to listen to it again because I remember it being a lot of good outsourcing strategies, a lot of good ways to work with a team, a lot of good strategies around that. And so I said, let me listen to this again. Let me listen to it with where I am now, where my business is now, where the world is right now in terms of content consumption, how people are starting businesses, etc. And so that's what led me to read it again. And once again, I got those really good nuggets. And the biggest one that was impactful for me on my most recent journey was the outsourcing piece. And I know some people feel a certain type of way about outsourcing, and I really want us to stop thinking that way about outsourcing. I realized that when I like to watch a lot of those, how they built the brand kind of shows, like, the brands that made us and all those things. History Channel's a good one for those. But either way, I like to watch those kind of how this brand was built shows. And one of the things I realized was most of the brands, especially male founded brands, right, was that they usually had an assistant, had a somebody that went with them. Like I watched the Sam Walton show about Walmart, right, and Costco, and actually the whole war between the big box retailers when they first started. And each and every one of them walked away with at least one person who was there to help them. I remember watching the movie 9 to 5 back in the day. You guys remember? And then Dolly Parton, they had each other, right? They walked away as a group. Very rarely did I see or hear founders who started completely by themselves, right? No assistant, no person, best friend, no spouse, no one other person to help them do the work. And it wasn't always the person, like the idea person, right? There's always the founder, right? But usually there's somebody making calls, or there was somebody setting up appointments, or there was somebody doing something, right? And so in reading or listening to, because I did it on audio, the 4 Hour Work Week, and thinking about how I've seen all these other very, very successful now companies start, I started thinking, why am I doing all of this, so much of this myself, right? Now, I've always had like assistant here or a virtual assistant or something like that, but really it was like supplemental work. It wasn't like giving them a task that they're the ones responsible for doing. And that's what I really got from the 4 Hour Work Week, and the difference between how I was about bringing on team members and outsourcing then to how I'm doing it now is that there are people who are just responsible for content creation. Like not say I don't do as much of my content creation, but especially for the faceless pages, my job is to assign work, right? So I had to redefine even what my job and what my role in my own company was, right? My job was not to do the thing. And the more I started thinking about it that way, and reading and listening and moving my business in that way, that my job was not always to do the thing. My job was to assign the thing, come up with the ideas for the thing, make the plan for the thing. But my job was not to always do the thing. And so when I started building the way the 4 Hour Work Week kind of talks about, where he built this whole business based on outsourcing, right? And not necessarily, I know in the book, he talks about outsourcing in other countries and stuff like that, which I don't think is a bad thing. Most of my team is outside of the country, but outsourcing in some way and not making it my job, and having steady people, even if I don't always have that project, but having those steady people to do that work was super helpful for me. So that is part of the impact of the 4 Hour Work Week, and a couple of other books that I've read that have really helped to impact my business very early on in the beginning, before I got into the whole internet marketing thing, when I was just still thinking and looking at how traditional businesses run and marrying that with how I wanted to run my business online. Those are the books, and that's how 4 Hour Work Week really helped me with thinking about bringing on a team and, like I said, outsourcing, getting other people involved.